Well, hey everyone, I'm Janet B., recovered compulsive eater in North Carolina. Let me add my welcome to Melissa's. It's really nice to be here on this freezing cold night with all of you. If you're in Florida, please don't needlessly arouse jealousy by telling us, because most of us are freezing. So I'm here, and tonight I want to talk about God's search and rescue mission for Dr. Bob. So remember, we're all allowed to have our own concept of God. Here's mine. God created the world in 6 days, took a day off to rest, and instead of spending the rest of eternity watching Netflix, he decided he'd spend his time launching search and rescue missions for addicts like us. So here's the story of one of God's most successful search and rescue missions, the story of Dr. Bob, one of the co-founders of AA, the other one being, of course, Bill Wilson. So Dr. Bob's story comes right after the chapter A Vision for You in the Big Book. So if you have your big book, we're on page 171. And before we talk about how God rescued Dr. Bob, let's get some background on him. So he starts out by saying, I was born in a small New England village of about 7,000 souls. And he goes on to say everything was fine. His parents were fine. The town was fine. They were moral, good, blah, blah, blah. Everything was great. But he became an addict anyway. And I think that's really important because a lot of us say, well, the reason I'm a compulsive eater is because dot, dot, dot. And the dot, dot, dot is usually who we blame, and it's usually our parents. But remember, in the story in the book, Freedom from Bondage, page 544, the author says she didn't become an alcoholic because of what happened to her in her childhood, but that I am the result of the way I reacted to what happened to me as a child. So again, it's always on us. Are we going to forgive or are we going to blame? Because ultimately, the fact that I'm an addict has nothing to do with how I was raised. It has to do with the way I live life. And Dr. Bob will make that clear, so continue. And on page 172, he says, I was the only child which perhaps engendered the selfishness which played an important part in bringing on my alcoholism. Now, of course, if we only have one child, we should not race out to make another one or adopt another one right away, saying we're setting the stage for addiction, because he's not saying it's the only child part. He's saying it's the selfishness part. And later, he really digs in and defines it. He says, my whole life seems to be centered around doing what I wanted to do without regard for the rights, wishes, or privileges of anyone else. A state of mind which became more and more predominant as the years passed. Well, that's kind of interesting. We always talk about this illness being progressive, but we usually think of it in terms of food, right? Our binges get more and more, they get worse and worse. But he says even before the binging, his selfishness and self-centeredness got worse and worse. Well, that makes sense, right? Page 62 of our big book says selfishness and self-centeredness. That we think is the root of our troubles. So here's Dr. Bob agreeing selfishness and self-centeredness is the root. I actually drew a little picture of a tree in my big book, and I drew roots under the tree, and I wrote the words selfish and self-centered right by the roots. But the thing about roots is you don't see them. So we can be very good at hiding our selfishness and self-centeredness. But on a tree, we see the fruit. So I drew three little circles like apples, one with an R for resentments, one with an F for fear, and in the third one, an H for harms to others. Those are the fruits of this illness: resentments, fears, and harms to others. So here's Dr. Bob saying he was selfish and self-centered, and you can see it by the example he gave. He said, my parents made me go to church, and basically, I'll show them. I decided when I was old enough I'd never go to church. So he's turning his back on God, but he makes an exception. He says, I'll never go to church except when circumstances made it unwise to absent myself. So basically, he was like using church. Like, I'll go if someone will get mad at me if I don't go, or if it'll look good to a potential employer. He used God, he used church in a self centered, self serving way. So it made me think something I should ask myself, something we should ask ourselves. Do we use our religion? Do we use God? Do we ignore God except when we want to treat him like a genie in the bottle? Like, God, things aren't working out too well, so please come down and make everything good again. And if you do, thanks. I'll call you when I need you again. And if you don't, well, then I'll just ignore you even more. Never worked for me, didn't work for Dr. Bob. And he continues talking about the progression of his selfishness. He says through college, through medical school, he was drinking. And something I noticed when I was like preparing this on page 174, he says his father, while he was in college, made a long journey in the vain endeavor to get him straightened out, but it had little effect. Dr. Bob had a dad who really loved him and who may have died before Dr. Bob ever got sober. But he loved him, and Dr. Bob felt it. He mentions his dad's trying to help him twice in his story. And it made me think of times we might do things for people out of love and never see the results. Right? Imagine if Dr. Bob's father had said, I'm not going to try to help my son again. I don't see any results. None of us would be here. But he tried. And what that teaches me is that I need to love even when it's difficult and even when I don't see the fruit. So Bob becomes Dr. Bob, right? Every mother's dream. Bottom of page 174. But he says, by this time, I was beginning to pay very dearly physically, and in hope of release, voluntarily incarcerated myself at least a dozen times in one of the local sanitariums. Okay, this is a guy who wanted to get better. I mean, imagine like 6 times he locks himself up and people knew him. He was a doctor. But he said, I need to be locked up. I can't stop. So he had a desire to stop. But remember, desire alone doesn't do it. On page 24, it says that at the certain point in the drinking of every abnormal drinker, he passes into a state where the most powerful desire to stop is of absolutely no avail. So Dr. Bob had a desperate desire to stop, but he didn't have the power. So when the obsession struck and he was in the hospital, he did what any good addict would do. He got his friends to smuggle alcohol in for him, or he'd steal the alcohol in the building. So he got worse. He's in rehab, actually getting worse. And that was me for my first 7 years in OA. I went to meetings, I got sponsors, I did the work they told me, but I got progressively worse. I went from binging and purging twice a week to throwing up so much I needed major surgery on my esophagus. Like Dr. Bob, I had the desire. I did a bunch of work, but I was like someone with diabetes who just went to Diabetes Anonymous meetings without ever being taught how to inject insulin. I got worse, and so did Dr. Bob. Right? I mean, if we want it, we're going to get it. Or better still, if the illness demands we get it, we're going to find a way. I heard a woman say that she, like Dr. Bob, locked herself up in rehab, her for compulsive eating, and then she sent herself a candygram. We do stuff like that. Unless we are safe and protected by God, we have no choice when it comes to food. So there's Dr. Bob not getting better. His dad's trying to help him. His dad sends for a doctor from his hometown to go to him in college. And he's okay for a bit, but then prohibition starts. The country's going dry. So he says, I'll get drunk now because in a month, when prohibition starts, that means it's like illegal to drink anywhere in the United States. He said, I'll start then. But of course, there were bootleggers, people who got illegal alcohol to other people, and he was able to get it anyway. But it kind of reminds me of what I was like when I was binging, and I'd say, I'll start tomorrow. I had that I'll start tomorrow syndrome. So here's Dr. Bob. I'll start when prohibition starts. Or for me, I'll start Monday, or the first of the month, or the first of the year. I'll start tomorrow. What that really is me thinking my cure is my pillow. If I put my head on it for 7 hours, I'm suddenly going to be cured. I've seen commercials for something they call like a miracle pillow. Well, this would be a true miracle pillow, right? You put your head on it for 7, 8 hours, and you wake up cured. But it didn't work for me, didn't work for Dr. Bob. So here he goes. He working at a hospital. He drinks. He passes out at home. Then he wakes up, goes to work just so he could be at the hospital long enough to keep his job and earn money to drink. He kept this up for 17 years. 17 years. He says, and during this time, he says, I used to promise my wife, my friends, and my children that I would drink no more. Promises which seldom kept me sober, even through the day, though I was very sincere when I made them. Again, he was sincere. He had a desire, but desire alone doesn't do it. Imagine someone who has cancer going to their wife, their friends, their children, saying, I promise I'll make my cancer cells stop multiplying. It would be heartbreaking because we would know that person had zero power to make their own cancer cells stop multiplying. Dr. Bob had zero power to make himself stop drinking, and I had zero power to make myself stop binging. So he went on like this, and on page 178, he talks about a group of people he found, and he says, they attracted me because of their seeming poise, health, and happiness. So this was the Oxford group. This was a Christian spiritual group that helped people with different problems. And he was attracted by their poise, self-confidence, but not based on pride. It's based on the confidence that God's got my back, that God's taking care of me, so I can be comfortable in any situation. And that's what these people had. He said they had great freedom from embarrassment. They were at ease on all occasions and appeared healthy, but most of all, they seemed happy. And really, that's a trait, that's a promise that we get in recovery, right? Our book says we are sure God wants us to be happy, joyous, and free. That's a natural fruit. We can't go searching for happiness, but as we do these steps, it just comes. So Dr. Bob, he's no dummy. He looks at himself, he sees he's ill at ease, his health was at the breaking point, and he's thoroughly miserable. And he said, I sensed they had something I didn't have from which I might profit, and I learned it was something of a spiritual nature, which didn't appeal to me very much. So he was honest. It's like, okay, I see they're happy, healthy, poised, and it's the result of this spiritual work. And he says, well, I don't like it, but this is what he said. I thought it could do no harm, so I gave the matter time and study for 2.5 years, but still got drunk every night. And isn't that a lot of us? I remember reading program literature while I was binging. Um, but it's like if someone has cancer and they're reading the manual on how chemo works, but not going for the treatment, they're not going to get better. And that was me. And that was Dr. Bob, reading, but not getting better. And in a lovely testimony to his wife, he says on page 178, how my wife kept her faith and courage during all those years, I'll never know, but she did. If she had not, I know I would have been dead a long time ago. His wife had courage and faith. And the word courage always makes me think of the Wizard of Oz, right? The cowardly lion. And what did that lion do? He continued on to Oz even though he had fear. And he had friends who propped him up when things got difficult. So in recovery, when we need courage, when we need to keep going, even when it's scary and hard, hopefully like we have friends that help prop us up along that yellow brick road. And Dr. Bob says his wife's faith kept him alive. How come? Like, what's the nexus between her faith and him getting better? Because faith actually does something in the spiritual world. Faith is the currency in the spiritual world. It leads us to communicate with God. And maybe it was her faith, her whispered prayers that led God to say, my next search and rescue mission will be for her husband. Or maybe it was because at that point, Dr. Bob said at one of the Oxford group meetings, held at the home of Henrietta Seiberling, remember that name, it'll come up again. She was on God's search and rescue team. He said, guys, I have this confession to make. I'm an alcoholic. And I can just see everyone like kind of trying not to laugh behind their hands. Like, yeah, Bob, tell us something we don't know. Like, you think we don't know you're an alcoholic? But Henrietta just said, we'll pray for you. And there they were praying for him. So their faith, coupled with Dr. Bob's wife faith, And all that praying, well, what was the result? I'm going to flip back a couple pages. We're going to see the result of all that prayer. Back in the chapter of Vision for You, page 155, we find our other hero, co-founder, Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson didn't live anywhere near Dr. Bob, but he just happened to be there on a business trip. He was newly sober. His business deal had gone down the tubes. He was not in good health. He had no money, and he was physically weak. 5 strikes against him. And he said, I better do something so that I don't go into that bar. So he went to the payphone, and there was a list of a half dozen churches. And he said, like, I need to find someone, like some priest or minister, who's going to give me a drunk to try to help, because I need to do that. And he called all 6. And not until the very last one did he get a pastor who said, I'll get you in touch with this woman who has a spiritual group at her house. Maybe she can help. So Bill Wilson calls Henrietta, and when she answers the phone, he says, my name is Bill. I'm in town for business. I'm newly sober. Do you know a drunk that I can help? And she just said, we've been expecting you. We've been expecting you. She knew that her prayers were going to work. So she wasn't like, I would probably be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe God answered the prayer. Like, we prayed for help for Bob. Wow. But she's like, we've been expecting you. We didn't know how the help would come, but we knew that it would come. Because God isn't limited by how we think things will happen. She might have thought he was going to get sober in the Oxford groups, but God had another avenue in mind. She said, we've been expecting you. So what happened then? She invited Bill over. She called Dr. Bob's wife and said, can you bring him over tomorrow to talk to this guy? And Dr. Bob said to his wife, fine, but I'm not going to be there for more than 15 minutes. So I actually did a little research in the book AA Comes of Age about that first meeting, how Bill prepped for that meeting. Bill talked to Dr. Silkworth, the author of The Doctor's Opinion, before he left Akron, because he said he was trying to help people and they weren't getting better. So they were talking strategy. And Dr. Silkworth said, you know, when you go there, just talk about your own experience of how you couldn't stop and then what you did. Not, starting with all this other stuff. Tell your story. Basically, Dr. Silkworth said the first thing we have to do is help someone see that they're powerless. And maybe that's why, for me, going to a therapist never worked, or going the religious route helps with lots of things, didn't help me stop binging. Because what Dr. Silkworth told him is basically a person needs to take a first step. Admit you're powerless, your life is unmanageable, ego deflation at great depths. And that's what had to be done. So Bill went in there, and instead of getting all spiritual and saying how great the Oxford group was, he just shared stories of how he used to drink. And he would say, I'm just going to have one, but would keep drinking until he pretty much lost everything. So he's telling Bob this, and I'm sure Dr. Bob was saying things like, yeah, I drink like that too. I did that too. So he went in there saying he was going to stay 15 minutes, and he stayed over 6 hours. That's another thing about Bill. He was willing to put in the time. And Dr. Bob was willing to do the work, but not willing enough. Page 155, it says, he's saying, a spiritual experience is absolutely necessary, but the price seems high upon the basis suggested. And why, he argued, should I foolishly admit my problem to my clients? I'll do anything but that. And as we'll see with him and, with a lot of us, it's our but that gets us in trouble. So Bill stayed with Dr. Bob for 3 weeks, kept working with him. Dr. Bob stopped drinking, and then he went, it was about 3 weeks later, he went to a medical conference, and he got drunk there. He got drunk coming back, and I find it fascinating what happens next. Dr. Bob gets drunk at the conference, drunk on the way home, wakes up drunk at a friend's house, not even knowing how he got there. The friend called his wife, who called Bill. And what did Bill do? He didn't say, you need to hear another voice, go get a new sponsor. He didn't say, I spent 3 weeks of my life working with you so you'd get better. How dare you do this with me? He didn't say, I told you that you shouldn't go away. I'm on the next train back to New York. Goodbye and good luck. He didn't do any of that. Here's what Dr. Bob said Bill did. He came and got me home and to bed. He took him home, he put him to bed. Think about putting a drunk alcoholic to bed. Bob probably smelled. Bill probably took his shoes off his dirty feet and covered him with a blanket. And Bill stayed with him. And there's an interesting line, page 180. It says that the next day, Bill gave him one glass of beer. So I'm thinking, like, why on earth did he give him a glass of beer the next day? That sounded strange to me. So I did a little research. And the reason is Dr. Bob was scheduled to do a surgery that only he could do just a couple days after he got back from that, medical conference gone bad. And he was shaking so badly that Bill gave him one glass of beer to steady his hand so that he could perform the surgery. So this is not to say that when we find a prospect that we give them one Hershey bar the next day. This was for a very specific person, very specific reason, so his hand wouldn't shake. And he did the surgery, which was successful, and Bob never drank again because right after that surgery, he went around the town and he told all the people he didn't want to tell, I'm an alcoholic. He did that so his I'll do anything but that became I'll do anything, period. And we know that that's critical. So if any of us are struggling now, we might want to think of, do I have any but that? I'll do anything but that, and then get with a recovered person and share it. Because if you're what that, but that, just as an aside, one woman once told me, well, I'm not willing to divorce my husband. I said, is your marriage good? And she said, yes. I said, is anyone telling you to divorce your husband? No, but I'm not willing to do that. I'm like, it's okay. This program is not going to tell you to divorce your husband. So if you have a but that, get with someone recovered and talk about it. So Dr. Bob was willing, and he never drank again. And he spends the last couple of pages in the story talking about his recovery and giving us many pearls of wisdom. He says, you may be asking, what did that man, Bill, do or say that was different from what others had said or done? Because, we can assume he's read the Bible, he's read tons of spiritual literature, he's been around spiritual people, he was a doctor, so he had access to medical information. First, he says, Bill gave him correct information. And I would couple that with love. He spent over 6 hours with him. Bob wasn't a project to Bill. Bill loved him. There's love. If you're going to take a drunk man home, take his shoes off, put him to bed, and stay and keep helping him. Love and good information. That sets the stage for recovery. And Dr. Bob says that of far more importance was the fact that he was the first living human with whom I had ever talked who knew what he was talking about in regard to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. And that goes along with what it says to the forward in the third edition. Recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope. But why? Like, why don't they say that? Hold on, I'm just going to mute everyone. Why don't they say recovery begins when I take a certain step? I think it's because when one addict talks to another addict, something happens. There's more than a conveying of information, there's a transmission. Bill Wilson was transmitting something to Dr. Bob. I looked up the definition of transmission. It says something like heat, light, sound, electricity, or some other energy passes through a medium, like telephones transmitting sound waves. And I think that in God's search and rescue mission for Dr. Bob, God used Bill Wilson to transmit God's own love and concern for Bob through Bill. And if we go back to page 164, the end of the chapter, A Vision for You, it talks about this kind of transmission. It says, obviously, you cannot transmit something you haven't got. So see to it that your relationship with Him, with God, is right, and great events will come to pass for you and countless others. See to it that your relationship with God is right. That's the condition. What does it mean? Well, remember when Bill Wilson first got sober and was in the hospital, he says, the thought came to me that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn could help others. But before Bill could be fit for this work, he had to see to it that his own relationship with God was right. How'd he do it? How do we all do it? Page 164 kind of sums it up. Abandon yourself to God as you understand him. That means basically give God a blank check with our lives. And obviously, we can't do that until we trust God. So, step two, we do a lot of work on learning to trust God. Page 164 continues on. Admit your faults to God. Okay, that's a little hard. And to your fellows. Well, that's a lot harder sometimes, right? Clear away the wreckage of your past. Give freely of what you find. And when we do that, we can join them in the fellowship of the Spirit in recovery. Bill did that. He made 6 calls. He didn't just make 2 and say, well, I give up, let me check it off the list. He went to this strange woman's house, and even before he went, he called Dr. Silkworth to brainstorm on the best way to help some guy he's never met. And then he spends over 6 hours with him that day. He stays in that town to help this guy for almost a month. And then when he finally thinks, yes, I've helped someone, Dr. Bob breaks his heart by coming home drunk. But he kept at it with Dr. Bob. And thank God, because if he hadn't, who knows if any of us would be here today. And every now and then, someone will say something bad that they've heard about Bill Wilson, like, oh, he did this thing or that thing that wasn't right. And what I say to that is, first of all, I don't know and it's none of my business. But more important, look what Bill did for Dr. Bob, for me, for you, for us. That's what we should always think about when we think of Bill Wilson. It's back to page 180. Dr. Bob is saying, it's the most wonderful blessing to be relieved of the terrible curse with which I was afflicted. He says he has regained his health, his self-respect, and his home life is ideal. And then he says he spends a great deal of time passing this on to others who want and need it badly. And he says he does it for 4 reasons. A sense of duty, it's a pleasure, because in doing so, he's paying his debt to the person who carried the message to him, and as an insurance policy against drinking again. First, it's a duty, because truthfully, sometimes, I don't know about all of you sponsoring, but I don't always want to pick up the phone. Sometimes I do, but not always. I don't always want to take the time. God hasn't like 100% finished on me, and I'm still selfish sometimes. So some days, yes, I do it just out of duty, but often, and more often as time goes by, it's for the second reason. It's a pleasure. And I wrote this talk a few years ago, and I'm thinking now, it's almost always a pleasure, truly is. The more we grow spiritually, the more what we have to do and what we want to do become more and more alike. His third reason, because in doing so, I'm paying my debt to the man who took time to pass it on to me. That's gratitude in action. And I have to tell you, when I hear my sponsees sponsoring someone or speaking at a meeting about how God removed their food obsession, there is nothing better. And last, he says, every time I do it, I take out a little more insurance for myself against a possible slip. It is our best insurance policy, right? Chapter 7, first line says, nothing will so much ensure immunity against alcoholism or compulsive eating as intensive work with other alcoholics, or for us, compulsive eaters. Intensive work. Dr. Bob continues by saying he used to get upset when he saw his friends drink, but realized he couldn't. So he schooled himself to believe that though he once had the same privilege, he abused it so frightfully, it was withdrawn. So we can do that. We can say to ourselves, self, I used to have that privilege to be able to do whatever, but I abused that privilege and now I don't have it anymore. Just like if we get too many DUIs, car accidents, tickets, our privilege to have a driver's license is withdrawn. And then Dr. Bob starts talking about tough love. He says, if you think you're an atheist, an agnostic, or skeptic, or have any other form of intellectual pride which keeps you from accepting what's in this book, I feel sorry for you. I find it very interesting. He calls atheism, agnosticism, and skepticism forms of intellectual pride, because that's really me thinking I can do it on my own. And note, he doesn't say if you're an atheist, agnostic, a skeptic. He says if you think you're an atheist, agnostic, or skeptic, meaning you may think you are, but you're really not. Remember, it would be like me thinking I have no lungs inside of myself. I could think it, I could say it, right? This is America. I'm free to think or say what I want. So I could say, I'm a lung agnostic. I don't believe I have lungs. But of course, what I think about my lack of lungs doesn't matter. And our book tells us, page 55, deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. So between those two lungs that I may or may not believe I have, God planted the fundamental idea of himself. And the big book says that this fundamental idea of God inside us may be obscured, but it's there. And, we could talk about this for hours about the things that block us from God. We have podcasts on the chapter We Agnostic and on Finding God. But for now, just suffice it to say, Dr. Bob is telling us you may think you're an agnostic, but you're not. And it's not so much a challenge as an invitation. Don't have so much pride that you block yourself off from the sunlight of the Spirit. And Dr. Bob continues on with his tough love. If you think you're strong enough to do it your way, that's your affair. Like, we're not going to try to convince you that you really need this. It says, but if you really want to quit for good and all, not just to look good for your high school reunion so that boy who dumped you when you were 17 feels bad, it says, if you want to quit for good and all and feel you need help, he says, we know we have an answer for you. And then here's his conditional promise. It never fails, but here's the condition we have to meet. It never fails if you go about it with one half the zeal you've been in the habit of showing when you were getting another drink. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I put a lot of zeal into getting binge foods. I stole food. I stole money for food. I walked the streets of New York City at 2 a.m. with my rent money because I had to get the food. Today, I've got to put that kind of zeal into my recovery. And he says, if we do this work, we are promised it will never fail. And on the last line, he tells us why it will never fail. Because our Heavenly Father will never let us down. God will never let us down. I believe that we are all here because God has launched a search and rescue mission for every single one of us. And he's given us a manual and people to help us so that we can recover and then join him on his search and rescue mission for others, the way that Bill joined and rescued Dr. Bob. And what a glorious sense of purpose for all of us, and what a glorious God to give that to us. And with that, I will pass.